All right, so you've given us quite the collection of stuff here about the U.S. prison system and the war on drugs. We've got documentaries, historical stuff, even some personal accounts. I guess what we're really trying to do today is to figure out how a country with 5% of the world's population ended up with 25% of its prisoners.
Yeah, it is a really stark contrast. And looking at all these sources, it seems like it goes way beyond just recent history. There's this deep connection to how racial and social control has played out in America, especially for Black communities.
Yeah. So we're talking a prison population of 2.3 million in 2015 compared to just 300,000 in 1972. That's a huge jump. And it seems like the 13th Amendment, the one that was supposed to abolish slavery, actually had a loophole that made this worse.
Yeah, the 13th Amendment does have that except as punishment for crime clause.
Yeah.
So after the Civil War, that exception was used to arrest Black Americans en masse for really minor things like loitering, vagrancy, things like that, and basically funnel them into forced labor through convict leasing.
So basically, slavery by another name, how does that tie into mass incarceration today, though?
Well, these systems of control, they sort of evolve. So convict leasing gave way to Jim Crow, and then as we'll see, the war on drugs becomes like another chapter in this story. And what's striking is how certain images, like that trope of the menacing Black male, are resurrected again and again to justify harsher law enforcement.
And the sources seem to really point to the war on drugs as like a turning point, but wasn't it meant to, actually reduce drug use?
Well, these sources, they paint a much more complicated picture. Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs in the 1970s was all intertwined with what's known as the Southern Strategy. So it wasn't just about drugs, it was about politics. It was about using coded language to tap into racial anxieties among white voters.
Can you give us like a concrete example of this coded language and how it played out?
Sure. One example is the emphasis on law and order. While seemingly neutral, this phrase in the context of the time, it played on these fears of social unrest and rising crime rates, which were often implicitly linked to Black communities. So this rhetoric helped justify harsher sentencing and an increased police presence in predominantly Black neighborhoods.
So are you saying that the war on drugs wasn't really about drugs at all?
Well, the sources suggest that it was more about leveraging these existing racial anxieties for political gain. You see, the Southern strategy wasn't explicitly about race, but it weaponized racial fears to shift white voters' allegiance, ultimately shaping criminal justice policy for decades to come.
And then Reagan comes along in the 80s and ramps things up even further.
Yeah. Reagan's escalation of the war on drugs really solidified its impact. Despite polls at the time showing that drug use wasn't a major public concern, his administration poured resources into law enforcement. They really militarized police and pushed for harsher sentencing. We see a clear shift from social programs and rehabilitation towards punishment as the primary response.
That's interesting that you mentioned public opinion. So there was kind of a disconnect between what the public wanted and what the government was doing.
Absolutely. The sources show this really stark contrast between public perception and policy decisions. While the public was more concerned with economic issues and unemployment, the government focused on this tough-on-crime agenda. They were pouring money into law enforcement and incarceration.
And Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign fits right into that, doesn't it? Kind of like a focus on individual responsibility instead of looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. Just say no, put the onus on individuals to resist drugs, but it completely neglected the systemic factors, like poverty and lack of opportunity that often contribute to drug use.
Yeah. And then you have the crack cocaine epidemic, which hit Black communities the hardest. And from what I see in these sources, the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine was just wild.
It's really one of the most blatant examples of racial bias in the war on drugs. Crack, which was more prevalent in Black communities, carried far harsher penalties than powder cocaine, despite being pharmacologically similar. This disparity just fueled mass incarceration, and it disproportionately impacted Black Americans.
It's just a tragic example of how fear and prejudice can shape policy, leading to real harm. The story of Khalif Browder, who spent 3 years in jail, including solitary confinement, for a crime he didn't commit, really drives that home.
Khalif's case and others like it, they really expose the human cost of these policies.
Yeah.
The pressure to appear tough on crime, fueled by media narratives and political rhetoric, it can erode due process and lead to wrongful convictions, especially for young Black men. And even when crime rates started going down, the prison population just kept going up. It's like the system kind of took on a life of its own.
It does seem like the war on drugs had support from both sides of the aisle, too. Democrats and Republicans, they both passed laws that kind of contributed to mass incarceration.
Yeah, that's right. The war on drugs, it wasn't really a partisan issue. Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill, with those three strikes laws and mandatory minimum sentencing, it played a significant role in this explosion of the prison population,
Mm.
especially in black and brown communities.
But hasn't Clinton kind of admitted that that crime bill had some serious flaws?
He has.
Yeah.
Yeah. In recent years, Clinton has acknowledged some of the unintended consequences of that 1994 crime bill, particularly its contribution to mass incarceration.
Hmm.
But the thing is, the impact of those policies, it still continues to this day.
It feels like once those laws are in place, it's just really hard to undo the damage.
Oh, absolutely. The sources really highlight how mandatory minimums, for example, they basically remove judicial discretion in sentencing. Judges couldn't consider individual circumstances, so it led to these really harsh punishments, even for nonviolent drug offenses. And this really created this fertile ground for what's called the prison industrial complex to take root.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but to be honest, it always sounds kind of like something out of a science fiction movie. What exactly is the prison industrial complex?
Well, it's not science fiction, unfortunately. What these sources reveal is that there's this whole network of corporations, private prisons, vendors, and even like the use of prison labor that all profit from mass incarceration. There are these powerful entities with a financial incentive to keep prisons full.
So it's not just about punishment anymore, it's a business. Who are some of the major players in this complex?
Well, one of the most prominent is CoreCivic, formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America. And they actively lobbied for policies that would lead to higher incarceration rates, working through organizations like ALAS, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
So these are the for-profit prisons, right? What kind of policies did they push for?
Oh, they were instrumental in lobbying for those three strikes laws, those mandatory minimum sentences, and even truth in sentencing laws, which limited the possibility of early release for good behavior. So these policies basically ensured a steady flow of inmates into the prison system, which directly benefited CoreCivic's bottom line.
It's incredible how these companies have influenced policy, even beyond just like what seems directly related to prisons. These sources mention things like stand your ground laws and Arizona's SB 1270 immigration law.
That's right. The reach of the prison industrial complex, it extends beyond those traditional criminal justice policies. So by supporting policies that increase arrests and detentions, like Stand Your Ground and SQ 170, they're creating more opportunities for profit within the system. Even policies that seem totally unrelated to prisons can be manipulated to feed this complex.
And what about the use of prison labor? I've heard about companies using inmates to make products.
Yeah. The sources really expose how corporations exploit prison labor. Inmates are often paid these extremely low wages, sometimes just cents per hour, to produce goods for companies like Victoria's Secret and JCPenney. It raises some serious ethical questions about forced labor and the exploitation of this captive workforce.
It's kind of hard to believe that's happening, like, in the U.S. But what about the human cost of all this? We talked about Khalif Browder's case, but the impact goes far beyond these individual stories, right?
Absolutely. Mass incarceration has these devastating consequences for families and entire communities. These sources are full of stories about all the challenges faced by people who have served their time.
So even after they've done their time, the punishment continues.
Exactly. A felony conviction, it creates these massive obstacles. It can be nearly impossible to find employment, housing, or even access education. A lot of states also restrict voting rights for felons. This creates this cycle of poverty and inequality that can impact generations.
It's like the system is literally designed to keep people trapped. But are there any signs of hope? Are there people working to change this?
There is. There's this growing movement for criminal justice reform in the U.S. Some states are starting to take action, reducing sentences, ending mandatory minimums, and they're starting to invest in rehabilitation programs.
It seems like such a complete shift in thinking. Instead of just locking people up, now there's a focus on giving them a chance to turn their lives around. What are some specific examples of these changes?
Well, one promising example is the Ban the Box movement, which advocates for removing the checkbox on job applications that asks about criminal history. This gives individuals with past convictions a fair chance to be considered for employment based on their qualifications, instead of being automatically disqualified.
So it sounds like there's some real momentum building for this kind of reform. Are there any specific programs that have been particularly effective in helping people reintegrate back into society?
Well, one notable example is the Delancey Street Foundation in San Francisco. It's a residential self-help organization that provides housing, job training, and counseling for former offenders. And what's really remarkable about it is that it's entirely run by the residents themselves, so it really fosters this sense of community and accountability.
That's amazing. It's inspiring to see people like taking ownership of their own rehabilitation and supporting each other like that. But these initiatives, they seem to be happening on a more like state-by-state basis. Is there any movement at the federal level?
Yes. Even at the federal level, we're seeing this shift in thinking. The First Step Act, which was signed into law in 2018, was actually a bipartisan effort to reform the federal prison system. And it aims to reduce mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses and expand early release programs for inmates who participate in these rehabilitative programs.
That is really encouraging to hear. It seems like even those who were once really strong supporters of the war on drugs are now recognizing the need for a different approach. The sources mention people like Hillary Clinton and President Obama expressing regret for their role in perpetuating mass incarceration.
It's a sign that the conversation is evolving. There's this growing awareness of the system's shortcomings and that really disproportionate impact it's had on communities of color. Even some conservative leaders, who are traditionally known for being tough on crime, are advocating for alternatives to incarceration now.
That's a huge shift. What's driving this change in perspective, even among those who were once, such strong proponents of harsh sentencing?
I think there's a few factors at play. There's this growing recognition of the financial burden of mass incarceration. States are realizing that investing in rehabilitation and diversion programs can actually be more cost-effective than simply building more prisons. And then there's also this growing moral imperative to address the racial disparities and injustices within the system.
So it's a combination of economic pragmatism and a sense of moral responsibility. It sounds like we're really at a pivotal moment. But some of the sources also caution that reform alone might not be enough.
Yeah, that's right. While reforms are definitely crucial, some argue that we need this more fundamental shift in how we approach crime and punishment in the first place. They point to the persistent influence of that prison industrial complex, which continues to profit from the system, even as these calls for reform are getting louder and louder.
So what do they propose as an alternative to the current system? What would this more fundamental shift actually look like in practice?
Well, one idea that's gaining some traction is restorative justice. And this approach focuses on repairing the harm caused by crime. So it brings together victims, offenders, and community members to find solutions that really address the underlying issues. It's really about accountability, healing, and finding ways to move forward together.
That sounds like a much more holistic and humane approach, focusing on rehabilitation and community restoration rather than just punishment. But the sources also express some concerns about the privatization of probation and parole.
Right, and that's a valid concern, because privatization often leads to a focus on profits over rehabilitation. And there's this worry that it could create this whole new system of control, with these private companies profiting from monitoring and surveillance and potentially targeting communities of color. So instead of reducing the harms of mass incarceration, you could just shift them to a new and more insidious form.
So it seems like after this deep dive, it's clear that mass incarceration, it's not just this single issue. It's really woven into our country's entire history of racial injustice and economic inequality. The war on drugs, with this focus on punishment over rehabilitation, has had these just devastating consequences for individuals, families, and entire communities.
And that prison industrial complex has created these powerful financial incentives to maintain this system, which makes reform even more challenging. But amidst all of this, there are these glimmers of hope. We're seeing this growing momentum for change. There's bipartisan support for reform, and there's this recognition of the need for a more just and equitable approach to crime and punishment.
We've also seen that these alternatives exist, like models like restorative justice and Portugal's decriminalization of all drugs. They offer this different path forward, one that's focused on rehabilitation, harm reduction, and addressing the root causes of crime.
And this kind of brings us to a final thought for you to consider. These sources really highlight the power of technology and media in shaping the whole narrative around crime and punishment. They can be used to expose injustices, but also to perpetuate these harmful stereotypes. So what role can you play in using these tools to advocate for a more just and humane system?